Let me just start by saying that I'm really honored to be participating in this inaugural conference. I do hope and wish that the Institute will actually foster genuine new thinking, not just in terms of academic economics, but in terms of policy and practical applications. In an attempt to contribute to this new thinking, Michael Goldberg and I have prepared this paper that kind of sketches some of our research over the last couple of years. The paper goes back to the foundations of Hayek and Keynes and Knight. Our work goes back to that. It goes back to the early criticism of REH that was developed by Ned Phelps, and I had the privilege of participating in that as well. And now Michael and I attempt to maybe suggest an alternative that draws on various strands that have already emerged, namely the emphasis on behavioral insights. Of course, the basic foundation here, this goes back to George Soros's talk, is imperfect knowledge. We start exactly in the same place. That's the place where Hayek, Keynes, and Knight, despite all other differences, actually meet. But then we think that there's a possibility of maybe bringing together behavioral insights and social contexts that have been emphasized by Bob Schiller and George Akerlof. So this is just an attempt. We'll see how it goes. So let me say that I'll make a number of claims here. Some of them are rather strong. Some of them will echo what George Soros was talking about, perhaps in a little more detail. I will have no time to substantiate those claims and to develop them fully, so they sort of, just for the legitimacy, so to speak, they've been developed in our recent book, in many papers with not just ourselves, but with Søren Johansen and Katarina Juselius, and in the book that is forthcoming. The question that we want to ask is whether, when one starts with imperfect knowledge, can one construct theory that involves no timeless generalizations? So there's a complete agreement on this. Yet this theory is mathematical, and it can be subject to rigorous empirical testing. So that's basically the objective. It's unclear. This is work in progress. It's unclear how far we can get on this. In the talk, I will focus on foundations, and particularly on something that unites the Chicago School and the neo-Keynesians, and in some peculiar way in which I'll explain behavioral economies, the rational foundations of contemporary economic theory. So the first part of the talk will basically question the very idea of rationality, and will attempt to interpret the failure of rational market models and REH models in other contexts, not as an evidence that market participants are irrational, but actually as evidence that economists' approach to modeling rationality is irreparably flawed. So that's the first part. And the second part, we'll take it from there and ask the question, what can we do, perhaps, to move forward? Okay? So the view that is currently prevailing, that I will not discuss at length, just to connect to the crisis, is that the large upswings in housing and equity markets, which many regard as proximate causes of the financial crisis, are widely seen as demonstrating that market participants are irrational, emotional, and ignore fundamentals. But blaming market participants for being irrational avoids the key issue. In our view, the real failure of contemporary macroeconomics and finance models arises from their portrayal of rational decision-making. The debate triggered by the crisis, summarized by the economists in 2 articles addressing what went wrong with economics and how the disciplines should change to avoid the mistakes of the past, largely overlooked the key problem. I think I have the wrong version of the slides mounted. I don't know how I get around that. The impossibility of establishing a standard approach to modeling how a rational individual makes decisions. So I'll have to skip because I sent in a revised version, but it's not here. Okay, so the centerpiece of this economy standard of rationality is the rational expectations hypothesis. It's actually a tremendously striking idea that has been motivated, I like to emphasize, by something that was actually a very profound thought, as opposed to the way it has actually been implemented, which has been rather unfortunate and led to where we are theoretically. The profound thought was that market participants, in making decisions, understand the context and the environment that they're in, and therefore they will take into account changes in that environment. That was the original motivation by John Muth. The problem started when the hypothesis was implemented as a way of modeling rational forecasting, as forecasting according to the economist's own model. So whenever an economist constructs a model, he has a mechanical way for modeling expectations on individual and aggregate level. Because this can be done in every model, REH appears to be universally applicable. In fact, you can, any context appears, you just write down the model. As Tom Sargent had put in an extremely important characterization of this hypothesis, individual's thinking is not something that drives the outcome, it's the outcome of the economist theorizing. Or once the problem of modeling expectations has been solved in such universal and striking way, that opened way to powerful modeling. It opened a way of pricing instruments that I will not talk about, and on and on. And all of this can be done outside of markets. It could actually literally be done at the economist or the financial analyst desk. And it has indeed been done for decades. Now, I want to talk about this standard view of what is thought about rationality just for 1 second. Behavioral economists, in fact, this is the raison d'etre of behavioral economics, and non-academic commentators often criticize economists' standard of rationality as implying that rational individuals make decisions as if it is an abstraction. They had superhuman abilities to understand the future, that they can compute correctly the consequences of alternative options available to them. That's usually considered a normative standard of rationality, that whenever that standard fails, one says people are just not as perfect as economists think. But the smart people in the behavioral models, quote unquote, are those that have those abilities. And of course, the ones that are not smart are the causes of all problems in markets. This has very profound implications for public policy and economic theory that I will not have time to discuss. Instead, I want to advance a different view, which parallels very much what George was alluded to in passing in his talk. REH does not presume that individuals have superhuman abilities. The first point is the one George already made. I'm going to skip it. The rational individuals may interpret outcomes in many different ways. That's not the one that I really want to, although this is a very important point, I want to add to it and focus on a slightly different thing. The key question is, how is there, I'm basically talking about economic theory. So how is the rational expectation actually constructed? So to just say that expectations are constructed according to the economist model, of course, is insufficient. One has to say what that model is. And all of the models, including behavioral finance models in contemporary economics, share one feature. Over the last 4 decades, economists have come to believe that to be worthy of scientific status, their models should generate sharp probabilistic predictions. They should account for the full range of possible market outcomes and their likelihoods. Okay, this has an extremely profound implications. In fact, one of the implications that Bob Lucas had pointed out, and really the most profound contribution that he's made to economics, is to understand that once you agree on this, the only consistent way to model is rational expectations. And every model that departs from it, including all behavioral finance mathematical models, are inherently internally inconsistent. And that insight, Lucas made that point, actually in connection with his criticism of the Keynesian models, but of course he proposed a solution to this problem that is called REH, and it's that solution that is the problem, not that insight. So what do we need in order to generate such predictions? In order to generate such predictions, economists must pre-specify in full how an individual alters the way she makes decisions and how aggregate outcomes unfold over time. If you can't pre-specify in advance, you can't have only one probability distribution. Therefore, these models disregard the key feature of markets, non-routine change that cannot be pre-specified in advance with mechanical rules. That means these models ignore the key feature that make capitalism, if there's any feature that makes capitalism different substantially than any other system, is innovation, non-routine change, things that no one can pre-specify in advance, both in regulation, in government policy, and markets. They explicitly rule it out by assumption. Because every model is fully predetermined implies a single overarching strategy. So that means there's only one interpretation. Thus, of course, REH ignores the diversity of reasons. But because REH model, and that's the key point, it disregards non-routine change, it presumes that participants act as if nothing genuinely new would ever happen that would lead them to change the way they think about the future. Okay? So this is exactly so the question is not that REH is an abstraction, but REH is what we call a castle in the air. It creates an artificial world that has no connection with the real world, and then in the context of that world, it is an approximation. So it's not a question of realism of the assumptions, a la Milton Friedman. As Tony Lawson says, it's an ontological problem as opposed to the assumptions problem. But profit-seeking individuals, of course, cannot afford to adhere to a fixed overarching strategy in real-world markets in which non-routine change is an ever-possibility. Thus, REH, contrary to the usual interpretation, presumes that market participants forego using whatever cognitive abilities they do have in thinking about the future and making their decisions. Okay? So it's not that they have superhuman abilities. They actually are not even minimally rational. They don't use any abilities. They just follow a fixed strategy forever. Indeed, we demonstrate that economists' characterizations of rational forecasting would appear to any reasonable person, let alone a profit-seeking participant in financial markets, to be obviously irrational. The point George made, we actually make this point mathematically, in a sense that their trading decisions forgo obvious profit opportunities. Thus, REH imagines a place devoid of the crucial features that characterize even in the most rudimentary, abstract way how individuals think about the future in real-world markets. I will make that shorter. Another interpretation of REH is that it's an approximation to the diversity of views that people have. This is what we have to say on that. It is not an approximation to diversity because it actually has to impose what we call a pseudo-diversity on revisions and differences in views for the model in aggregate to hold. So suppose in aggregate REH is correct, then of course it has to impose a pseudo-diversity. And once you have diversity, of course, once on average, forecasting strategies add up to a correct prediction of the future, namely the market is rational, every single person that is different than the average, of course, is obviously irrational. Their forecasts generate systematic forecast errors. Thus, REH's so-called rational markets are populated. There are two options. Either they're populated by irrational individuals. No, this is not that people who don't behave according to REH are irrational. The people who behave according to REH are irrational. Okay, that's the point. Or those who presume that there is no diversity on a micro level. All market participants think exactly alike about the future. It will surely make George Orwell wake up. So what is the emerging alternative? Before we get into this, I just want to read from a wonderful quote by Ken Rogoff, because rather than saying that there are all these failures, there's nothing like reading from the master of the literature. After writing their magisterial book on international macroeconomics, Maury Obstfeld and Ken Rogoff concluded, note page 625, the undeniable difficulties that international economies encounter in empirically explaining nominal exchange rate movements are an embarrassment, but one shared with virtually any other field that attempts to explain asset price data. This is 12 years before the crisis. The crisis is just a sort of there's so many failures that have occurred before the crisis. Of course, it's well known, and this was a very important literature, the first real erosion of this monopoly has, of course, been behavioral economics, which uncovered massive evidence that these conventional models are grossly inconsistent. Early work of Bob Schiller from '79 has been a path-breaking paper, and so on and so forth. This evidence is important because it opened economics to alternative explanations of individual decision-making market outcomes. However, in building behavioral finance models, formalizing their insights, behavioral economists retain the core of the contemporary approach. Like their REH predecessors, behavioral finance models formalize empirical findings about how individuals act with fully predetermined mechanical rules. And then the next step in research, of course, is to figure out where these rules come from, and then we have now an extensive way of looking at MRIs and neuroeconomics as an attempt to provide an alternative foundation to these rules. Moreover, behavioral economists, despite of the fact that they discovered that these models are so woefully inadequate, did not interpret the failure of REH models as evidence that fully predetermined models of rationality cannot adequately capture how rational individuals make decisions. Instead, they concluded that market participants are irrational. Given this interpretation and their shared belief in the scientific status of fully predetermined accounts, behavioral economists ended up embracing mechanical models of irrational decision-making. To be sure, not all, as I mentioned, not all behavioral economists embrace fully predetermined models. Most notably, George Akerlof and Robert Shiller rely on a largely narrative mode of analysis. This enables them to develop richer and very interesting, in many ways, very informative descriptions of fluctuations than fully predetermined models of rational and irrational behavior can deliver. So where do we go with modeling without universal rationality? And now we go to this question of modeling, and actually is mathematical modeling possible? So the first claim here is that there's, of course, an alternative interpretation of a failure of REH models. It's an obvious one. Purposeful decision-making, particularly individual forecasting, cannot be adequately portrayed with economists' fully pre-specified mechanical rules. And I'm particularly honored to be saying this in this hall because, of course, that insight was completely and totally understood by John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Frank Knight. This is nothing new at all about that insight. The question is, well, can we do theory with such a state of affairs? This alternative interpretation implies that fully predetermined models of rational and irrational behavior, whatever that means, which I, of course, have no time to go into, are outside the reach of economic analysis. We urge conventional and behavioral economists to consider this premise and abandon REH as model for individual market forecasting as well as policy analysis. Imperfect knowledge economics that Michael and I have been attempting to develop for quite some time now, that is in this our 2007 book and the forthcoming, begins with this premise. So let me now sketch in a minute or two the differences and similarities with the conventional view. Like the contemporary approach, IKE bases its models of aggregate outcomes on mathematical representations of individual behavior. Unlike contemporary models, IKE attempts to come to terms with the modesty of Keynes, Knight, and Hayek about how exact the representations of individual behavior should attempt to be. Moreover, IKE does not attempt to provide an overarching model of market outcomes that works in all contexts, past, present, and future. I do not have the time to deal with this, how that's done, but the real guide to this is a spectacular book by Karl Popper, no other person, of course, Poverty of Historicism. In fact, you don't need to read the whole book. The way in which he talks about the way we should do social sciences, even modeling, is on page 4 in the preface. IKE presumes that purposeful behavior cannot be fully pre-specified in advance. So how do we model if we can't pre-specify in advance? It explores the possibility that the ways in which market participants make and alter their decisions may be formalized with qualitative conditions. I will qualify that soon. What mathematical apparatus do we use to do mathematical models? I already excluded the possibility of a single standard probability distribution. So obviously that's not really open to us. So we try to develop what we call a non-standard, for a lack of a better word, probabilistic formalism to do that. And the bottom line of this is that no IKE model implies only one probability distribution. And the IKE models, when they move through time, they move in a historical time, and they move in such a way that there's a transition from one set of probability distributions to another, where the qualitative constraints is what the predictions of IKE models on those distributions are. In contrast to REH, multidisciplinary insights play a crucial role in constructing IKE models. As George Soros emphasized, once we get rid of a priori assumptions, we have to have something to model, so we have to have the context, we have to have the insights, we have to have all of those things, otherwise we can't construct a model. Instead of what the contemporary belief that economics explains outcomes in other fields of human inquiry, something that economists are very fond of doing, these disciplines play an integral role in IKE-based accounts of economic phenomenon, something that Lord Skidelsky had emphasized in a wonderful article in the Financial Times, in which he emphasized that the most essential thing now for reform of economics education is that actually economists are taught all these other things. It's a simple proposal that is a little harder to implement. IKE models formalize the psychological insights, and just some examples and findings of behavior economists. These models also formalize observations about the social context within which individuals make decisions, including the historical record, conventions, and norms among market participants. While IKE models by design do not imply sharp predictions of change, they do generate qualitative predictions that enable an economist to distinguish empirically among alternative explanations of economic phenomena. In the interest of full disclosure and not false advertising, this part is definitely work in progress, although some progress has been made. So let me conclude with the following few thoughts. In our 2007 book, we show that the problems that Ken pointed to with Mori at the end of their book, namely the problem of explaining fluctuations and risk, once one places imperfect knowledge at the center of analysis, as needless to say, George has emphasized, as long as I know him, that means for a long time, one sheds new light, not just in terms of descriptions, but actually in terms of modeling. One does genuinely shed new light on the questions of risk, insights of Keynes come in, even on the issues of risk, and that has implications for regulations and things like this. These results, of course, are promising, but it's much too early to claim broader usefulness in macroeconomic and policy modeling. In contrast to the conventional and the behavioral models, which seek to understand economic decisions with fully predetermined rules, IKE's constraints are qualitative and context-dependent. That's what gives them the historical time. If qualitative conditions can be found in contexts other than asset markets, IKE provides a way to model individual behavior and market outcomes based on those conditions. But in contexts in which revisions of forecasting strategies and other aspects of behavior cannot be adequately characterized with qualitative conditions, empirically relevant mathematical models of the observed time series may be beyond the scope of economic analysis. In this sense, IKE is not a unified approach, because of course everyone will introduce this element depending on their understanding of the context. So it's just a sort of like a framework, but it does provide a boundary for what modern macroeconomic theory can deliver. And the contemporary models lie outside of that boundary, and that's my conclusion. Thank you.